She was supposed to be home by midnight. That was the rule Emily Vargas had promised her mother, before heading out that Saturday night in August 2010, the kind of warm Los Angeles evening where the air hung thick with jasmine and possibility. At 22 years old, Emily was a rising star in the competitive gymnastics world, training 6 days a week at a prestigious facility in Burbank. Her body a precise instrument of discipline and grace, she had spent the last 4 years rebuilding herself. After a devastating ankle injury had derailed her Olympic dreams, channeling that loss into coaching younger athletes while competing in regional championships. Her apartment in Silver Lake was small, but hers decorated with medals and photographs of her midair suspended in moments of perfect control. The party was at a friend's house in the hills above Sunset Boulevard, one of those sprawling mid-century homes with floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the city lights below like a painting. Emily had been hesitant to go, mentioning to her roommate that she felt exhausted from a particularly brutal training week, but her friend Rebecca Santos had insisted, promising it would be low-key, just a few people from their gym and some mutual acquaintances. Emily wore jeans and a simple white tank top, her dark hair pulled back in the practical ponytail. She never seemed to abandon, even on her nights off. She drove her silver Honda Civic up the winding roads just after 9, texting her mother. When she arrived to say she was safe, witnesses would later tell police that Emily seemed relaxed that night, nursing a single beer while sitting on the outdoor patio, talking about an upcoming competition in San Diego. She laughed at someone's joke about her strict diet, mentioned she was thinking about adopting a rescue dog, checked her phone occasionally, but never seemed distracted or worried. Around 11:30, several people saw her say her goodbyes, hugging Rebecca and waving to a few others, before heading toward the street where cars lined both sides of the narrow road. She was alone, she was sober. She was 3 blocks from her car. That was the last confirmed sighting of Emily Vargas as a living, breathing person walking through the world when her mother, Patricia Vargas, woke at 2 in the morning to find no missed calls and no daughter sleeping in the next room during what was supposed to be a weekend visit. The first cold finger of dread traced down her spine. Patricia called. Emily's cell phone 11 times. Each call went straight to voicemail. Emily's cheerful recorded voice, promising to call back soon by dawn. Patricia was calling hospitals, then friends, and finally the police, her voice breaking as she tried to explain that her daughter never broke promises, especially not this one. Not about coming home. The discovery of Emily's car came 36 hours later, found by a jogger in a small parking area near Griffith Park, tucked beneath the shadow of oak trees where the morning light barely penetrated. The silver Civic sat perfectly positioned between the white lines. Driver's door locked, windows up inside. Everything appeared untouched. Emily's brown leather purse rested on the passenger seat, wallet intact, with $63 in cash and all her credit cards present. Her gym bag was in the trunk, still smelling faintly of chalk and sweat. Her phone was gone. There were no signs of struggle, no broken glass, no blood, no scratches on the paint. The car simply sat there waiting, as if Emily had intended to return any moment. But she never did. The key to understanding what happened to Emily Vargas had vanished with her into the vast indifference of a city too large to notice one missing girl, even one who could fly. Detective Martin Fisher had worked missing persons cases for the Los Angeles Police Department for 16 years, long enough to recognize the difference between someone who wanted to disappear and someone who had been disappeared. Emily Vargas, he knew within the first week, belonged firmly to the second category. Everything about her life screamed stability and purpose. Her bank account showed regular deposits from her coaching job, modest withdrawals for groceries and gas, nothing unusual. Her social media accounts revealed a young woman focused on athletics, posting videos of her routines, encouraging her students, sharing healthy recipes. There were no desperate messages, no concerning relationships, no digital breadcrumbs suggesting She wanted to vanish into thin air. Fisher assembled a team and began the methodical work of retracing Emily's final hours. They interviewed 43 people who attended the party that night, filling yellow legal pads with notes that ultimately led nowhere. Everyone described the same scene. Emily had been friendly, relaxed, maybe a little tired. No one saw her argue with anyone. No one noticed her leaving with a companion. No one remembered seeing any suspicious vehicles or strangers lurking nearby. The host, a physical therapist named Jason Hoffman, who worked with athletes from Emily's gym, seemed genuinely devastated, cooperating fully and providing a detailed guest list. Fisher's instincts told him Hoffman was clean. The ex-boyfriend angle emerged quickly, because it always did. Emily had dated someone named Marcus Sullivan for 8 months, ending things amicably 3 months before her disappearance, when their schedules and life goals no longer aligned. Sullivan, a graduate student in environmental science at UCLA, had been camping in Big Sur with 5 friends. The weekend Emily vanished, a fact verified by dozens of photographs, campground receipts, and ranger station logs. Fisher cleared him within 72 hours. The neighborhood canvas around Griffith Park yielded frustratingly. Little security cameras in 2010 were less ubiquitous than they would become just a few years later, and the ones that existed near the park offered grainy, low-resolution footage that was nearly useless in the darkness. One camera from a nearby residential street captured what might have been Emily's Honda, driving past at 11:52, but the image quality was too poor to see who was driving or if anyone else was in the vehicle. Another camera positioned at a gas station a mile away showed a dark sedan following the same route 4 minutes later, but the make, model, and license plate were impossible to discern through the pixelated blur. Patricia Vargas became a fixture at the police station, arriving every morning. With coffee and questions, her eyes increasingly hollow as days turned into weeks, she organized search parties enlisting Emily's gymnastics students, their parents' coaches from neighboring gyms, anyone who would spend a Saturday combing through the brush and ravines of Griffith Park. Volunteers walked in careful lines through the dry California scrub, calling Emily's name into the vast silence, finding nothing but trash and animal bones. The local news covered the story for 2 weeks, Emily's smiling face appearing on the tennial broadcast, before newer tragedies pushed her aside. Fisher worked the case obsessively for 6 months, following every conceivable lead. He examined Emily's phone records, finding nothing unusual in her call patterns. He investigated whether she might have witnessed something criminal at the party, some transaction or confrontation that made her a target but came up empty. He explored the possibility of a random predator, someone who saw an opportunity in a young woman walking alone at night, but without a body or crime scene. He had nothing concrete to pursue by March 2011. The active investigation had slowed to a crawl. Emily's file was transferred to the cold case unit, joining hundreds of others in a basement archive where hope went to gather dust. Patricia Vargas, however, refused to let her daughter become just another name in a folder, a statistic of the disappeared, a ghost story told in gymnastics gyms across the city. The contradictions began to emerge, like fault lines in what should have been solid ground. 3 weeks after Emily's disappearance, a woman named Jennifer Kobayashi came forward, hesitant and apologetic, saying she had been at the party but left early, and only now realized what she might have seen. She told Detective Fisher that around 11:40, while walking to her own car, parked 2 blocks down from the party, she had seen a young woman matching Emily's description, standing beside a dark blue or black sedan, talking to someone. Inside, the woman seemed calm, not distressed, and after a brief conversation she had opened the passenger door and gotten in. Voluntarily, the car drove away, heading east. Kobayashi apologized profusely for not coming forward sooner, explaining she had been dealing with a family emergency, and only connected the dots when she saw Emily's face on a missing person flyer at her local coffee shop. Fisher felt a surge of hope. finally something concrete, until he interviewed 2 other witnesses, who told completely different stories. A college student named Andrew Lewis, who lived in the neighborhood and had been walking his dog that night, insisted he saw a young woman fitting Emily's description walking alone down the hill toward Sunset Boulevard around midnight, moving quickly, with her arms wrapped around herself as if cold. Despite the warm August air, he remembered, because she seemed upset, maybe crying, and he had considered asking if she needed help, but ultimately decided against approaching a stranger late at night. Then there was Marcus Chen, a delivery driver finishing his shift, who claimed he saw a silver Honda Civic that looked like Emily's parked at a different location entirely near the Griffith Observatory around 1 in the morning, with 2 people sitting inside having what appeared to be an intense conversation, though he could not see their faces clearly through the glare of streetlights on the windshield. The problem was that none of these accounts aligned with each other or with the physical evidence. If Emily had gotten into a dark sedan voluntarily at 11:40, how did her car end up miles away at Griffith Park? If she was walking alone and upset at midnight, where was she going, and why would she later return to drive her car somewhere else? If she was in her vehicle at 1 in the morning with another person, who was that person? And where did they go afterward? Fisher conducted follow-up interviews, pressed witnesses for more details, showed them photographs of Emily and various vehicles, but the stories remained maddeningly inconsistent. Memory, he knew, was a notoriously unreliable witness, especially when weeks had passed and people were trying to reconstruct brief glimpses of strangers in darkness. The investigation into Emily's personal life continued to yield nothing suspicious. Her laptop, recovered from her apartment with her roommate's permission, contained exactly what one would expect: training schedules, emails about competition logistics, research about nutrition, and injury prevention. Photos from gymnastics meets her browser. History showed searches for apartment furniture, veterinary clinics for the dog she wanted to adopt, and tutorials for new coaching techniques. There were no secret dating profiles, no concerning messages, no financial troubles, no hidden conflicts. Her friends, when pressed harder in second and third interviews, all said the same thing. Emily was focused, driven, kind, maybe a bit of a perfectionist about her sport, but utterly normal. In every other way, she did not use drugs, rarely drank more than a single beer, and spent most of her free time either training or with family. Marcus Sullivan, the ex-boyfriend, remained cleared, but Fisher interviewed him twice more anyway, searching for something, anything that might have been missed. Sullivan spoke about Emily with genuine affection, describing their relationship as important, but ultimately incompatible with their different life trajectories. He was heading toward a PhD program on the East Coast. She was rooted in Los Angeles with her coaching career. The breakup had been sad but mutual. They had not stayed in close touch, exchanging only occasional friendly text messages. He showed Fisher their final conversation from 2 weeks before her disappearance, a brief exchange about a movie they had both wanted to see, ending with Emily saying she hoped his research was going well by late 2010. Fisher found himself staring at a whiteboard covered in contradictory witness statements, unexplained timelines, and photographs of a smiling young woman whose fate remained completely opaque, as if she had simply stepped through a door into another dimension where the normal rules of evidence and logic no longer applied. The official letter came in February suit, 12 printed on Los Angeles Police Department letterhead, the language carefully bureaucratic and impersonal. The case of Emily Vargas was being transferred to the cold case unit due to exhaustion of active leads. This did not mean the investigation was closed. The letter emphasized only that without new evidence or information, detectives could no longer justify the resources required for daily active pursuit. Patricia Vargas read the letter 3 times, sitting at her kitchen table in the small house in Glendale, where Emily had grown up, where her daughter's childhood bedroom remained. Exactly as she had left it, medals still hanging on the wall. gymnastics posters fading in the California sunlight that streamed through windows, Patricia could no longer bear to close. Patricia was 51 years old, a high school teacher who specialized in English literature, a woman who had raised Emily alone after her husband died in a construction accident when their daughter was only 6. She had poured everything into Emily, attending every competition, driving to every practice, sacrificing vacations and personal ambitions, so her daughter could pursue gymnastics at the highest level. They had been more than mother and daughter. They had been partners, best friends, co-conspirators in the project of building a life worth living. Now that life existed only in past tense, and Patricia found herself unable to accept the bureaucratic verdict that her daughter would become just another file in a box, another name on a list of unsolved disappearances, another tragedy swallowed by a city too vast to care about one missing girl. She began her own investigation with the methodical determination of someone who had nothing left to lose. She created a blog titled Finding Emily Vargas, posting updates, sharing theories, maintaining a timeline of events that she refined constantly as she conducted her own interviews. She tracked down every single person who had been at that party, showing up at their workplaces and homes with photographs and questions, refusing to be dismissed or deterred. Most people were kind but increasingly uncomfortable with her intensity. Some stopped returning her calls, a few threatened restraining orders. Patricia did not care. She designed missing person flyers that she updated every few months with new information, posting them at gyms, coffee shops, college campuses, anywhere young people might gather. She spent thousands of dollars on a private investigator, who after 3 months admitted he could find nothing the police had missed every August on the anniversary of Emily's disappearance. Patricia organized memorial vigils at Griffith Park, near where the car had been found the first year. Over 100 people attended, lighting candles and sharing memories, while news cameras recorded the scene. By the 3rd year, attendance had dwindled to a handful of Emily's closest friends and former students. By the 5th year, it was just Patricia and her sister standing in the darkness holding photographs and electric candles, because the park rangers no longer allowed open flames. The city had moved on. The world had moved on. Patricia could not. She maintained a spreadsheet of every detective, every witness, every piece of evidence, calling the cold case unit monthly to ask if there were any updates, knowing the answer before she asked, but unable to stop herself from asking. Anyway, she learned the language of forensic investigation, taught herself about cell phone tower triangulation and cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar. She wrote letters to the district attorney, the mayor, local television stations, anyone who might have the power to bring resources back to Emily's case. Most letters went unanswered. The few responses she received were sympathetic but ultimately useless, explaining about limited resources and hundreds of other families also seeking justice. Patricia's colleagues at school began to worry about her, noticing how she had lost weight, how her hands trembled slightly when she held chalk to write on the blackboard, how she sometimes stopped mid-sentence during lessons as if her mind had traveled somewhere far away. Her sister urged her to see a therapist, to consider medication for what was clearly becoming complicated grief. Patricia refused grief, implied acceptance of loss, and she could not accept that Emily was gone, truly gone, without knowing what had happened in those final hours. The not knowing was a wound that would not close, that woke her at 3 in the morning, with scenarios playing out in her mind, each one more terrible than the last, none of them providing the closure that might have allowed her to continue living instead of merely existing in this suspended state, between hope and despair. The construction crew arrived at the Pasadena property on a Tuesday morning in April 2018, when the California hillsides were still green from winter rains that would soon surrender to the brutal dry heat of summer. The property belonged to an elderly woman named Margaret Thompson, who had recently moved into assisted living, and her children had hired a contractor to expand the back deck and add a swimming pool before putting the house on the market. The land itself was challenging terrain sloping sharply downward from the main residence, thick with overgrown rosemary and sage that had gone wild over decades of minimal maintenance. Oak trees cast deep shadows across the soil, their roots creating networks beneath the surface that made any excavation work complicated and slow. Roberto Almeida was operating the backhoe when he felt the machine shudder slightly, the bucket catching on something that should not have been there. He had been digging for nearly 3 hours, removing soil to create the foundation for the pool's deep end, working carefully, because this area was known for old irrigation pipes and forgotten electrical lines. When he climbed down to investigate what had caused the resistance, he noticed something pale protruding from the dark earth, something that looked almost like a piece of weathered wood, but had made his stomach turn even before his conscious mind understood what he was seeing. He called over his supervisor, Michael Gallagher, who took one look and immediately told everyone to stop working and step back from the excavation site. The police arrived within 20 minutes, followed shortly by technicians from the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office, who cordoned off the entire backyard with yellow tape that snapped and fluttered in the warm wind. What had initially appeared to be a single bone proved to be part of a much larger discovery. Over the next 6 hours, working with brushes and small tools, forensic anthropologists carefully exposed what remained of a human skeleton buried approximately 4 feet below the surface in what had once been a much deeper hole. That time, and settling earth had gradually compressed the body, had been placed in a fetal position, wrapped in what appeared to be deteriorated plastic sheeting that had mostly disintegrated, leaving only fragments. Clinging to the bones, there were no clothes, no jewelry, no immediate identifying features, just the anonymous architecture of a human body reduced to its most basic elements by years in the ground. Dr. Sarah Quinn, the forensic anthropologist who supervised the excavation, noted several important details in her initial assessment. The skeleton was complete, suggesting the body had been buried intact rather than scattered or moved. The bones showed no signs of animal predation, which indicated the burial had been deep enough and secure enough to prevent scavengers from disturbing it. Based on pelvic structure and skull morphology, the remains belonged to a female, likely in her early 20s. At time of death, there was evidence of significant trauma to the left side of the skull, a fracture pattern consistent with a powerful blow from a blunt object, the kind of injury that would have caused immediate incapacitation and likely death. Within minutes, the soil around the remains contained no personal effects except for a few small items that had somehow survived a broken hair elastic, the kind used by athletes and dancers, and fragments of what might have been a leather strap, possibly from a watch or bracelet, though too degraded to offer any useful information. The property's history was immediately investigated. Margaret Thompson, now 87, and suffering from advanced dementia, had lived in the house since 1973 with her late husband, who had died in 2005. Their children insisted that the backyard had always been heavily overgrown, that their parents had never done any significant landscaping work in that area, that they could not imagine anyone in their family having anything to do with buried remains. Detective Christine Marino, who had taken over many of the department's cold cases, began the painstaking process of determining when the burial might have occurred. The decomposition suggested the body had been in the ground for at least several years, possibly more than a decade. Tree roots had grown through and around the remains, which botanists estimated would have taken at least 8 to 10 years to develop. To that extent, the bones were transported to the coroner's office for detailed analysis, DNA extraction, and comparison against missing persons databases in 2018. The technology for genetic identification had advanced dramatically from what had been available in 2010, and there was cautious optimism that if this person had ever been reported missing, if their DNA or that of their relatives existed anywhere, in the system identification might finally be possible. The DNA analysis took 4 months, a frustrating eternity for Detective Marino and her team, but relatively quick by the standards of forensic laboratories, overwhelmed with backlogs of cases, competing for limited resources and equipment. The process involved extracting genetic material from the femur and teeth, the bones most likely to contain viable DNA after years of environmental exposure. The samples were degraded, fragmented by time and soil chemistry, but advances in sequencing technology made it possible to construct a partial profile that could be run through multiple databases in August 2018. The lab finally delivered results that sent shockwaves through the Los Angeles Police Department's cold case unit. The remains belonged to Emily Vargas. The match was definitively confirmed through comparison with DNA samples that Patricia Vargas had provided years earlier, when Emily first disappeared samples that had been sitting in storage, waiting for exactly this kind of circumstance after 8 years of not knowing of existing in that terrible liminal space between hope and grief. Patricia finally had an answer to one question, even as 1,000 others emerged. Her daughter had not run away, had not started a new life somewhere else, had not been living under an assumed identity. Emily had died probably within hours of her disappearance that August night in 2010, and someone had buried her body in a place where it might never have been found, if not for an elderly woman's decision to renovate her backyard before selling. Detective Marino immediately pulled the original case file from 2010, spending several sleepless nights reviewing every interview, every piece of evidence, every dead-end lead that Martin Fisher and his team had pursued. The cause of death was now known: blunt force trauma to the skull, a devastating blow that had fractured the temporal bone and likely caused a fatal subdural hematoma. This was not an accident. This was not a random tragedy. Someone had struck Emily Vargas with enough force to kill her, and then that person had transported her body to a residential property in Pasadena and buried it carefully enough to keep it hidden for nearly a decade. The question of access to the Thompson property became paramount. Who would have known about that isolated, overgrown section of backyard? Who would have felt confident enough to spend the time necessary to dig a grave deep enough to conceal a body? Marino interviewed Margaret Thompson's children, extensively reviewed family photographs and home videos, searched for any connection. Between the Thompson family and Emily Vargas, there was none. Margaret's husband had been a retired aerospace engineer who spent his final years building model airplanes in his garage. The children had all moved away decades ago, visiting only for holidays. None of them had any involvement in athletics or gymnastics. None of them had attended the party where Emily was last seen, but the property itself revealed an important clue in 2009 and 2010, according to permits filed with the city. The Thompsons had hired a landscaping company to do extensive work on their property, installing new irrigation systems, building retaining walls to address erosion problems, and clearing brush to reduce fire danger. The company was called Greenscape Solutions, a small operation based in Burbank. The owner was a man named David Hernandez, who was now 48 years old. Marino obtained the employee records from 2010, which showed that Hernandez had worked on the Thompson property multiple times between March and September of that year, sometimes alone, sometimes with his younger brother Carlos, who served as his assistant and general laborer. This was the breakthrough. Marino had been waiting for someone with legitimate access to the property, someone who would have known the layout of the land, someone who could have been there digging without arousing any suspicion from neighbors or the homeowners. She began investigating David Hernandez with renewed intensity, pulling his financial records, his phone records from 2010, his social media presence. What she found made her pulse quicken. In the summer of 2010, Hernandez had been a regular at the same Burbank gym where Emily trained and coached. He had taken a few beginner adult gymnastics classes there ostensibly to improve his fitness and flexibility for his physically demanding work. Emily had not been his coach, but they had been in the same building multiple times per week. Marino dug deeper into social media archives, using tools that could recover deleted posts and messages from platforms like Facebook and MySpace. The dominant networks of that era, what she discovered in David Hernandez's old MySpace account, buried in private messages that he had apparently forgotten existed, changed everything. There were messages to Emily Vargas, sent over a period of 3 months in 2010, starting friendly, and gradually becoming increasingly personal, flirtatious, and eventually desperate. Emily's responses, when she responded at all, were polite, but clearly uncomfortable. Maintaining professional boundaries with someone she barely knew. The final message from Hernandez, sent 2 days before Emily disappeared, asked her to meet him for coffee to discuss something important. There was no evidence Emily had ever replied. Detective Christine Marino sat in the digital forensics lab on a grey November morning in 2018, watching as technician James Kennedy navigated through layers of archived data that most people assumed had been lost forever to the digital void. The reality was that nothing ever truly disappeared from the internet, not completely social. Media companies maintained server backups for years, sometimes indefinitely, and with the proper legal warrants and technical expertise, it was possible to resurrect conversations that users believed had been deleted long ago. Kennedy had been working on David Hernandez's old MySpace and Facebook accounts for 3 weeks, meticulously recovering fragments of data, rebuilding timelines, cross-referencing metadata that revealed not just what had been said, but when and where it had been sent. What emerged was a portrait of obsession that had somehow remained invisible during the original investigation. In 2010, David Hernandez had attended the party where Emily was last seen. He had never mentioned this to police, had never come forward as a witness, had never appeared on the guest list that Jason Hoffman provided. Because Hernandez had not been formally invited, he had shown up with a group of people from the gym, casual acquaintances, who assumed he belonged there just as they did. And in the chaos of a crowded party spread across multiple rooms and outdoor spaces, no one had thought to question his presence. Kennedy found a Facebook post that Hernandez had written at 11:17 on the night of Emily's disappearance, checked in at an address that matched the party location, with a comment that read simply, "Finally getting to talk to her." The post had been deleted within 24 hours, but the metadata remained a digital ghost, waiting to testify. Marino obtained additional warrants for Hernandez's email accounts and discovered something that made her hands shake. As she read, in the weeks following Emily's disappearance, Hernandez had exchanged emails with his younger brother Carlos that were carefully worded. But deeply suspicious, one message from David to Carlos, sent 3 days after Emily vanished, read, "Thanks for helping me with that project on Tuesday night. I know it was hard work, but it had to be done. Let's never talk about it again." Carlos had responded with a single word. Okay, there was no other context, no explanation of what project required hard physical labor in the middle of the night, no reason provided for why it could never be discussed again, but the timing aligned perfectly with when Emily's body would have been buried at the Thompson property, where David Hernandez had legitimate access and a valid excuse for being on the grounds at unusual hours. The cell phone records from August 2nd, 2010 had been preserved by the service provider, though retrieving them required extensive legal maneuvering and cooperation from corporate attorneys who initially resisted requests for data that old. When Marino finally obtained the records, she discovered that David Hernandez's phone had pinged off cell towers in a pattern that placed him near the party location at 11:43, then moving toward Griffith Park around midnight, then in Pasadena at 2:30 in the morning, exactly where Emily's body had been found buried 8 years later. His phone remained in the Pasadena area until nearly 5 in the morning before returning to his apartment in Burbank. Carlos Hernandez's phone showed an identical pattern starting at 1:15, suggesting he had joined his brother after the initial events had already transpired. But perhaps the most damning piece of evidence came from an unexpected source. David Hernandez had kept a pair of work boots in his garage for years, boots he wore for landscaping, jobs that required digging and heavy labor. His wife Lisa Hernandez had mentioned them to police during a routine interview, noting that her husband was strangely protective of those particular boots, never allowing her to throw them away. Despite the fact that they were old and damaged, when forensic teams executed a search warrant on the Hernandez residence in December 2018, they seized the boots and sent them to the lab for analysis. The soil embedded in the treads and stitching soil that had been there for nearly a decade proved to be a perfect match for the soil composition at the Thompson property, where Emily's remains had been discovered. More specifically, it matched the soil at the exact depth where the body had been buried, a distinctive layer containing specific mineral content and clay consistency that existed nowhere else on the property. Marino built her case methodically, aware that 8 years had passed and memories had faded, and defense attorneys would challenge every piece of circumstantial evidence. She re-interviewed everyone from the original investigation, this time asking specifically about David Hernandez. Several people remembered seeing him at the party, now that she prompted their memories with photographs. One woman, Angela Stewart, recalled seeing Hernandez following Emily outside when she left, staying about 20 feet behind her, though at the time it had not seemed particularly significant. Another witness, Thomas Clark, remembered seeing a man matching Hernandez's description standing beside a dark blue truck, parked near where Emily's car would later be found, smoking a cigarette and appearing agitated, checking his phone repeatedly around midnight. The circumstantial web was tightening, each thread connecting to another, creating a pattern that was becoming impossible to ignore or explain away. As coincidence, the forensic accounting proved almost as revealing as the physical evidence. Detective Marino's team discovered that in the weeks immediately following Emily's disappearance, David Hernandez had made several unusual financial transactions that had somehow escaped scrutiny during the original investigation, likely because he had never been considered a suspect and, therefore, his finances had never been examined. On September 2nd, just 10 days after Emily vanished, Hernandez withdrew $8,000 in cash from his business account at a small credit union in Burbank. The withdrawal slip indicated it was for equipment purchases, but there were no corresponding receipts, no invoices, no new equipment appearing in his business inventory or tax filings. The money had simply disappeared into the same void that had consumed Emily Vargas. Marino theorized that at least some of that cash might have gone to Carlos Hernandez as payment or incentive for his silence and assistance, though proving this would be nearly impossible without Carlos's cooperation. Carlos, now 39 years old and working as a warehouse supervisor in Ontario, had built a quiet life far removed from his brother's landscaping business. When Marino and her partner approached him at his workplace, his face went pale and his hands trembled as he lit a cigarette with shaking fingers. He invoked his right to an attorney, immediately refusing to answer any questions. But his reaction spoke volumes. Innocent people asked what was happening, demanded explanations, expressed confusion. Carlos Hernandez had simply shut down, recognizing immediately that whatever structure of denial and suppression he had maintained for 8 years was finally collapsing. The investigation into David Hernandez's personal life revealed a man whose outward appearance of normality concealed deeper issues with impulse control and obsessive behavior. His wife Lisa, when interviewed separately and assured of confidentiality, described a husband who could be charming and hardworking, but who also displayed troubling patterns of fixation on women he found attractive. She mentioned several incidents over the years where David had become inappropriately invested in female clients or acquaintances, sending excessive messages, showing up uninvited at places they frequented, unable to accept rejection or disinterest. Lisa had confronted him about this behavior multiple times, threatening divorce on at least 2 occasions, but David always apologized profusely and promised to change. She had never suspected him of violence. She insisted, had never imagined he could hurt someone. But looking back now through the lens of what police were telling her, certain memories took on sinister new dimensions. The timeline reconstruction became increasingly detailed as Marino's team worked backward from known facts. They theorized that David Hernandez had attended the party, specifically to engineer an encounter with Emily, that he had approached her as she left, possibly offering her a ride or claiming her car had a flat tire, or inventing some pretext that would explain why she should go with him, the witness who saw someone resembling Emily getting into a dark vehicle voluntarily. Now made perfect sense. Emily would have recognized Hernandez from the gym, would have had no reason to fear him, might have accepted help or conversation with someone she considered a casual acquaintance at some point, probably in his truck or at a secondary location. Hernandez had made unwanted advances that Emily rejected, leading to an escalation that ended with him striking her with enough force to fracture her skull. The physical evidence from the autopsy suggested Emily had been struck from behind or from the side, a blow she likely never saw coming. This indicated the attack might not have been premeditated in the traditional sense, but rather an explosion of rage when Emily refused him definitely. When his fantasy of a relationship with her collided catastrophically with reality after killing her, Hernandez would have faced the immediate problem of what to do with her body. He could not simply leave it somewhere, could not risk it being found quickly, with evidence potentially linking back to him. But he had access to the perfect burial site, a property where he worked regularly, where his truck and his presence would not arouse any suspicion, where the overgrown backyard offered privacy, and the excuse of legitimate landscaping work explained any disturbance of soil. The call to his brother Carlos made sense in this context. Moving a body and digging a grave deep enough to conceal it required help, required someone David trusted absolutely, someone who would prioritize family loyalty over morality or law together. The brothers had transported Emily's body to the Thompson property in the early morning hours, probably wrapped in the plastic sheeting found with her remains, and spent hours digging a grave in the darkness beneath the oak trees, backfilling the soil, carefully scattering leaves and debris to disguise their work in the days that followed. David likely returned to do some actual legitimate landscaping in that area, further obscuring any signs of disturbance, creating layers of innocence over the buried guilt. By January 2019, Marino had assembled enough evidence to present to the district attorney's office. The case was entirely circumstantial. There were no eyewitnesses to the actual killing, no confession, no murder weapon, no physical evidence directly tying David Hernandez to the moment of Emily's death. But the accumulated weight of digital records cell, tower data, soil analysis, and witness statements created a narrative that was compelling and coherent. The arrest came on a Thursday morning in March 2024, nearly 14 years after Emily Vargas had walked out of that party and into a nightmare that would consume her life and haunt everyone who loved her. Detective Marino had spent the previous 5 years building an airtight case, working with prosecutors to address every possible defense argument, every gap in the timeline, every alternative explanation that expensive attorneys might present to a jury. The district attorney had been cautious, aware that circumstantial cases could crumble under the scrutiny of skilled defense counsel, aware that losing meant David Hernandez would walk free forever under double jeopardy protections. But by early 2024, the evidence had reached critical mass, and a grand jury returned an indictment for second-degree murder and improper disposal of human remains. David Hernandez was now 48 years old. Heavier than he had been in 2010, his dark hair threaded with grey, his face marked by lines that suggested years of stress and sleepless nights. He lived in a modest house in Glendale with his wife Lisa and their 3 children, 2 daughters and a son who ranged in age from 12 to 17. His landscaping business had grown modestly successful over the years, employing 5 workers and maintaining contracts with several commercial properties and homeowners associations neighbors described him as quiet, reliable, the kind of man who kept his lawn immaculate and always waved hello, but never lingered for long conversations. His children attended local public schools, played soccer and volleyball, posted cheerful photos on social media. That showed a family that appeared completely normal, unremarkable in every way that mattered to casual observers. When Marino and 6 other officers arrived at the Hernandez residence at 6 in the morning with an arrest warrant, Lisa answered the door in her bathrobe, confusion transforming into horror. As she comprehended what was happening, the children were still asleep, and Marino had specifically timed the arrest early to minimize their trauma, to allow Lisa a chance to send them to relatives. Before news trucks arrived and turned their lives into a public spectacle, David Hernandez was in the kitchen making coffee when the officers entered, and for a moment he simply stood, frozen, the coffee pot in his hand, his face cycling through expressions that Marino had seen countless times in her career: shock, fear, resignation, and finally a strange kind of relief that suggested the weight of carrying this secret for 14 years had become unbearable. He did not resist. He set down the coffee pot carefully, as if worried about making a mess, and placed his hands behind his back. Without being asked, his wife was screaming, demanding to know what was happening, insisting there had been some terrible mistake, that David would never hurt anyone, that this was insane. But David said nothing, would not look at her, kept his eyes fixed on the kitchen floor as officers recited his Miranda rights and LED him toward the front door. One of his daughters appeared at the top of the stairs, rubbing sleep from her eyes, asking what was wrong. Why were police in their house? Lisa rushed to intercept her, to shield her from seeing her father in handcuffs, from witnessing the moment when their family's carefully constructed normality shattered into pieces that could never be reassembled. The interrogation began 4 hours later at the Central Los Angeles police station, in a small beige room with fluorescent lights that hummed softly and a mirror that everyone knew was not actually a mirror. David Hernandez sat across from Marino and her partner, his hands folded on the metal table, his public defender beside him, advising him to remain silent for 90 minutes. He followed that advice, saying nothing, as Marino methodically presented the evidence. The cell phone records the soil analysis, the social media messages, the witness statements, the financial transactions. She laid photographs on the table one by one, including pictures of Emily Vargas alive and smiling, and then photographs of the skeletal remains found in the ground where David had buried her. Then something broke inside him. Perhaps it was seeing Emily's face again after all these years. Perhaps it was the accumulated exhaustion of carrying guilt that had poisoned every moment of his life since that August night. Perhaps it was simply the recognition that lying was no longer possible or sustainable. His attorney was in the middle of advising him to end the interview when David suddenly spoke, his voice hoarse and quiet. He said he wanted to tell the truth, that he was tired of living with what he had done, that his wife and children deserved to understand why their lives were about to be destroyed. His attorney objected strenuously, but David waved him off, with a gesture that seemed almost peaceful, as if confession was the first honest thing he had done in 14 years. What emerged over the next 3 hours was a story that combined pathetic delusion with catastrophic violence. David admitted he had become obsessed with Emily after seeing her at the gym, convinced himself that she was interested in him. Despite clear evidence to the contrary, interpreted her professional politeness as romantic encouragement. He had gone to the party specifically to talk to her, had approached her as she walked to her car, had convinced her to sit in his truck for a moment because he needed to tell her something important. In the confessional fog of that interrogation room, David Hernandez described how Emily had listened patiently at first, as he told her about his feelings, his belief that they had a connection, his fantasy that she might leave with him that night and start something real. Emily had been kind but firm in her rejection, explaining that she was not interested, that she had never given him any reason to think otherwise, that he needed to respect her boundaries and stop contacting her. David claimed he accepted this initially, thanked her for her honesty, and let her get out of his truck. But as he watched her walk away, something inside him snapped a rage he described as coming from somewhere outside himself, as if he were watching his own actions from a distance. He followed her, caught up to her in the darkness between street lights, grabbed her arm to make her listen to more of what he needed to say. Emily pulled away, told him firmly to leave her alone, threatened to call the police if he did not stop that threat. He said was what triggered the violence he picked up. A piece of landscaping timber that happened to be in the bed of his truck equipment he used for building garden borders, and he swung it at her initially, meaning only to scare her, to make her understand he was serious. But the blow connected with the side of her head with terrible force, and Emily collapsed instantly, blood spreading dark across the pavement. David claimed he never meant to kill her, that it was an accident born of panic and rage, but the forensic evidence suggested the blow was delivered with enough force to indicate intentional violence rather than a warning gesture gone wrong. Panicked and realizing what he had done, David had loaded Emily's unconscious or already dead body into his truck, driven her car to Griffith Park to create confusion about her whereabouts, wiped down the steering wheel and door handles with a shirt from his gym bag, and then called his brother Carlos in a state of complete hysteria. Carlos, according to David's account, had initially refused. To help had screamed at him over the phone about the magnitude of what David had done, but ultimately blood loyalty and fear of his older brother's rage had won out over morality. Carlos met David at a neutral location, helped him drive to the Thompson property, where David had access and familiarity, and together they spent nearly 4 hours digging a grave deep enough to ensure Emily would not be found by animals or casual hikers. Carlos never touched the body. David insisted never participated in the actual killing, but he wielded the shovel and he kept the secret, making him complicit in ways that the law would recognize, even if David's version of events minimized his brother's role. The district attorney moved quickly to indict Carlos Hernandez as well, charging him with accessory after the fact and improper disposal of human remains. When officers arrested Carlos at his workplace in Ontario, he broke down immediately, sobbing and confirming the essential details of David's confession, while insisting he had been terrified of his brother, that he had lived with crushing guilt for 14 years, that he had wanted to come forward countless times but could not bring himself to destroy his family or send his brother to prison. His attorney would later argue that Carlos was a victim of David's manipulation and intimidation, a younger brother who had been conditioned since childhood to obey and protect his older sibling, regardless of the cost. The prosecution counted that Carlos was an adult who made a conscious choice to bury evidence of murder, rather than calling police, that his guilt and fear did not absolve him of responsibility for helping ensure Emily's family suffered 14 years of not knowing what had happened to their daughter. The trial began in September 2024 and lasted 6 weeks, covered extensively by local and national media as a case that illustrated both the power of modern forensic technology and the devastating human cost of violence against women. Patricia Vargas attended every of controlled anguish as she listened to details about her daughter's final moments. Emily's former students, now adults themselves, came to show support, filling the courtroom with silent presence that, served as reminder of all the lives Emily might have touched if she had been allowed to continue. Living David Hernandez's defense attorneys argued that the killing was not premeditated, that their client had acted in a moment of passion and panic, that second-degree murder was appropriate, but that he deserved consideration for his confession and cooperation. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Carlos Hernandez, tried separately, was convicted of accessory after the fact and received a sentence of 8 years in prison. David Hernandez was sentenced to 25 years to life with eligibility for parole after serving the minimum term, though the judge noted that the cruelty of burying Emily and allowing her family to suffer for 14 years weighed heavily against any future leniency. Lisa Hernandez filed for divorce before the trial concluded, her statement to the court expressing devastation at the betrayal, at learning that the man she had built a life with was capable of such violence and deception. Patricia Vargas gave a victim impact statement that reduced the courtroom to silence, describing 14 years of suspended grief, of birthdays and holidays marked by Emily's absence, of a hole in the world that could never be filled. She said she was grateful to finally have answers, to know where her daughter was, to be able to bring Emily home for a proper burial. But she also said that justice, while necessary, could not restore what had been taken, could not give back the years, could not resurrect